Well, I'm very excited about showing you the signs in the sky that convinced the Magi that the Messiah had been born, the King of the Jews. And what were those signs? Well, you had the crowning of the star Regulus by the planet Jupiter in the constellation of Leo, Virgo rising, clothed with the sun and the moon at her feet, and the Christmas star remaining stationary over Bethlehem. But before I show you all of that, I need to spend some time talking about the Magi. Because if you don't know who the Magi were, you won't understand why they were studying the sky in the first place. And you won't understand why they were looking for a sign that would indicate that the Messiah had been born, the King of the Jews. And you surely won't understand why Herod and all of Jerusalem were troubled when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem. So let's talk about the Magi. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Matthew, chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." Now, to be honest with you, most people know very little about the Magi. And the reason they know very little about the Magi is because they know very little about the history of the Middle East. And if you don't believe me, just ask someone to tell you about the Babylonian Empire, or the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Parthian Empire. And what you'll find is that most people don't know squat when it comes to those three empires. Even Christians know very little about them, and they should know because so much of the Old Testament has to do with those three empires. And what's sad is if you don't know anything about those three empires, then you won't know anything about the Magi. So let me explain the history of the Magi, and I want to tie it into the history of those three empires so that you can understand the important role that those empires played and the Magi played, and why the Magi were looking for signs in the sky that would indicate that the Messiah had been born, the King of the Jews. And let's start with the origin of the Magi. Who were they? Where did they come from? Well, to make it very simple, they were Medes. And the Medes were an ancient Iranian people who lived in an area known as Media. It was where modern-day Iran is today. Now, the Medes were made up of 6 tribes: the Busei, the Paratasini, the Strucatis, the Arazanti, the Budai, and the Magi. Now, the Magi were the priests. They were the religious leaders for all of the rest of the Median tribes, just as the Levites were the priests for the tribes of Israel. Now, let me explain where our word Magi comes from. Our English word Magi comes from the Greek word megos. And the Greek word megos is a transliteration of the ancient Persian word megas, which meant wise. So the Magi were considered to be very wise. And because of their wisdom, they served inside the royal palace as part of the king's advisors. First in the Babylonian Empire, and then in the Medo-Persian Empire, and finally in the Parthian Empire, which was the empire at the time of Christ and Christ's birth. So the Magi that went to Jerusalem at the time of Christ's birth were from the Parthian Empire. Now, the Magi were considered experts in 2 fields. First of all, you had astronomy. They were experts in astronomy, and they were also experts in oniromancy. How many of you have ever heard of oniromancy? Well, that's a very fancy word for the interpretation of dreams. So astronomy and oniromancy were their 2 areas of expertise. And that's very important, and you'll see why as we go through the history of these 3 empires. But first, let's talk about the impact that Daniel had on the Magi. Because the Magi would have never traveled to Jerusalem looking for Jesus had it not been for Daniel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief history of these 3 empires, and I'm also going to weave stories of Daniel into it to show you how he impacted the Magi. And I'm going to do that so you can see how Daniel changed everything. So let's start with the Babylonian Empire. Now, naturally, most of you would think that I would start with the Assyrian Empire, but we're really more concerned about Judah and not the 10 northern tribes. If you remember, Assyrian Empire actually came and conquered the 10 northern tribes and took them into captivity, but they did not conquer Judah. They did not conquer the 2 southern tribes. So we really want to pick it up at the time of the Babylonians. In 626 BC, Babylon rebelled against the Assyrian Empire. And in 612 BC, they overthrew the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. But they didn't become a world power until they defeated Egypt in 605. Now, right after they defeated Egypt, they turned on Israel, and in 605 BC, they took the first captives from Judah, and Daniel was among them. In fact, Daniel was just a teenager when he was taken into captivity, probably 14 to 15 years old. Now, this first group of captives were the upper class. You see, there were actually 3 groups taken into captivity at different times. This was the first group. They were the most educated and the wealthiest of all the Judeans, and they were taken for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Babylonians wanted to deplete Judah of the brightest citizens, the smartest citizens, the wealthiest citizens, in order to keep Judah, or Judea, I should say, very weak. And the second reason they wanted to do that is because they wanted to strengthen their own nation. So whenever they conquered a nation, they would bring in the most talented and the most intelligent men from the other nations. So Daniel was taken to Babylon as a teenager, and he was allowed to continue his education. Now you need to understand, as part of the upper class, part of being wealthy, he already was educated, but his education wasn't finished. So when he was brought into captivity, now he's going to be educated by the Babylonians. And the reason the Babylonians were doing that is because they thought that the upper class were the most intelligent. Therefore, they were the ones they wanted to train in order to help their empire to progress. So turn with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. Let's read verses 17 through 21. It says, "As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." Now who are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? We know them as who? Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, right? That's who those 3 are. "Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examines them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus." Now, shortly after Daniel began working in the royal palace, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Actually, it was a nightmare, and it woke him up. And he immediately called for the Magi, and he brought them in, and he wanted them to interpret his dream, because that's what they did. They interpreted dreams. The only problem is he didn't just want them to interpret his dream, he wanted them to tell him what he had dreamed. And there was a reason for this. He realized that they might be able to schmooze him. They might be able to make something up, and it wouldn't be a true interpretation of his dream. And the only way that he could ensure that they were giving him a true interpretation of his dream is if they told him what the dream was first. So he called them in. He said, "You're the Magi. You are the very wise of the wisest. I want you to tell me what I dreamed, and then I want you to interpret that dream." And they said, "Nebuchadnezzar, in all due respect, you're crazy. Only the gods can do that, and the gods do not walk with men." And so they couldn't do that. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is that it really frustrated Nebuchadnezzar, and so he ordered all of the wise men to be executed. Not just the Magi, but all of his advisors. Look at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2. "The king's demand is impossible. No one except the gods can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people." The king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. Now, most of you know the story. You know what happened. Daniel told the executioners, "Now, just hold on. Let me go to God, and I'm sure that God will tell me what Nebuchadnezzar has dreamed, and he will give me the interpretation," which God did. So Daniel went before Nebuchadnezzar, and he told him the dream and the interpretation, and Daniel was promoted over everyone else. Look at verse number 48. "Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all of his wise men." Now, the first part is referring to administrators. Daniel became the top dog over all of the administrators, but not just the administrators, because he goes down a little bit. He says he made him chief over all the wise men. Now, who were the wise men? The Magi. So not only was he over all of the administrators, but he was also over all of the Magi. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel, the 5th chapter, verse number 11. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. Now, I want you to underline that word chief. The word chief is translated from the Aramaic word rab, which meant supreme leader. So Daniel became the supreme leader over the Magi. And when that happened, he brought other Jews into this group. Men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But other men who were also faithful to Yahweh. And he did something else. He also replaced their religious practices with the Jewish religion. Now, you need to understand that before this time, the Magi were kind of into pre-Zoroastrianism. If you're not familiar with Zoroastrianism, that basically is the belief that there's a universal struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. And so they had this type of religion. But when Daniel is made supreme leader, he begins to substitute their religious practices because there are some common themes there with the Jewish religion, according to rabbinic tradition. Now, during this time that he was the supreme leader of the Magi, Daniel had several visions. He had the vision of the 4 wild beasts. He had the vision of the ram and the he-goat, and he also had the vision of the 70 weeks. And then Daniel was given the interpretation of these visions. These visions predicted what was going to happen in the future. First, the Babylonian Empire would fall, and the Medo-Persian Empire would take its place. And guess what? It happened just as Daniel predicted that it would. Then secondly, he predicted that a Greek ruler would invade and conquer the Medo-Persian Empire, but a short time later this leader would die, and his kingdom would be divided among 4 of his generals, and that's exactly what happened. Alexander the Great invaded Persia, and he conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, and after his death, the Grecian Empire was divided between his 4 generals. Let me show you a slide that reveals that. This is basically how it was divided. Cassandras was up here, and he took the western part, and the Lysimachus actually took what's now Turkey and that, and then the Seleucus actually came in and made the Seleucid kingdom and told him he was down here in the south. So all of Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, exactly the way that Daniel described that it would take place. And then he said that a 4th empire would rise, greater than any empire before, which of course was the Roman Empire. So Daniel was spot on. Now, Daniel received all of these prophetic visions while he was the supreme leader of the Magi in Babylon. In other words, he received all of these visions during the Babylonian Empire. But, and this is what most people don't realize, Daniel was alive when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Medo-Persian Empire rose to power. Now, many of you who've studied the book of Daniel, you remember that because when he was a very old man, he was the one that came in when the finger wrote those words on the wall, and we just read the little story where they brought Daniel in, and Daniel told them what those words mean. And he said, you're about to fall. The judgment of God is coming upon you, and this new empire is coming in. And of course, Daniel was alive then. He was alive when the Babylonian Empire fell and the Medo-Persian Empire came into power. In fact, when the Medo-Persian Empire came into power, Daniel once again was elevated to the supreme leader of that empire with no one above him with the exception of the king. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Daniel, the 5th chapter, verse 30, and let's read to chapter 6, verse number 3. That very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed, and Darius the Mede. Now, if you're like me, I was brought up hearing pastors say Darius. In fact, some of my professors would say that, and then they would correct themselves. Actually, if you want to pronounce it right, it was Darius. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and to protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all of the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't go over very well with the high officers and the other 2 administrators. Not just because they were jealous and envious of him, but also because Daniel was a Jew. He was not a Mede. And remember, originally the Magi were made up of this tribe from the Median people. They were the priests. And when Daniel was placed over them and he brought these other Jews, they resented it. And when the Medo-Persian Empire came into power, they thought that the king, Darius the Mede, he would just kind of work all of these Jews out of it and establish all of the Medes back into power. And yet here comes Daniel, who's a Jew. He's the one that was the supreme leader during the Babylonian Empire, and now he's going to be elevated again into that position. And of course, all these Jews are going to be with him. So they're very upset about this, and they devised a plot to get rid of him. They approached the king, and they urged him to pass a law that for 30 days, any person who prayed to anyone besides the king would be thrown into a lion's den. And of course, he did pass that law. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verse number 7. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. Now, let me just give you a little footnote here. Most people don't do the math. I found that out when we were going through the book of Genesis and we were going through the genealogies. I realized the majority of people just skip over that. So let me ask you this. How old was Daniel when he was thrown into the lion's den? Most people think of him as a young man. But you need to understand he was carried into captivity in 605 BC. He was probably 14 to 15 years old at the time. So if you go down to 600 BC, he was probably 19 to 20. Now, when did the Medo-Persian Empire rise to power? When did the Babylonian Empire fall and the Medo-Persian Empire come into power? 532 BC. And some time has passed, so let's make it 530 BC. Subtract 600 from 530, you have 70. If he was 20 at the time, we're talking about Daniel being about 90 years old when the lion's den occurred. He was not a young man, but he was an old man. Now, we all know the story. We were taught it in Sunday school. God shut the lion's mouth, therefore Daniel was not harmed. And in retaliation, the king had all of the men who urged him to pass that law. Now, remember, he gives us a whole list of who these men are. They hold high positions in every position in the kingdom. And he had all of these men who urged him to pass this law thrown into the lion's den along with their families. You'll find that in verse number 24 of chapter 6. And they all died. But the men who died were the leaders in this new empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. And the majority of them were Magi. So who filled their positions? You got it. Daniel filled their vacant positions with Jews. So the Magi were being infiltrated with more and more Jews at this time. Scholars estimate that during the Babylonian Empire, in the first time where Daniel comes in and he's able to do this, he brings about 30% of Jews in, so the Magi are made up of about 30% Jews. By the time the lion's den, the story of the lion's den occurs, now the Magi are made up of maybe 70 to 75% of Jews. Now remember, Daniel had changed the religious practices during the Babylonian Empire. And now that change is being reinforced and is going to continue all the way through the Medo-Persian Empire. And Jews are going to fill almost every spot. Most of us don't think of that. Go back and read the story of Esther. We see that these Jews are being put into these positions. And of course, it made Haman so mad that he wanted to exterminate them all because he didn't like that they weren't Medes. And it backfired on him. And all the people who were going to do them evil, the Jews in turn killed them. But the reason they could do that is because they held all of these high positions. So we're seeing more and more Jews coming into this empire. And yet many of us were ignorant of all of this. Now, all of these Jews are in this leadership position. Is everyone with me? Now, shortly after this incident with the lion's den, Daniel passes away. And about 200 years later, the Medo-Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great. That happened in 332 BC, just as Daniel had prophesied. And when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Let's put that slide up there again because I want you to see these 4 mini kingdoms. And this is where the Parthian Empire comes into play. So let's talk about the Parthian Empire. And the reason I want to talk about the Parthian Empire is because the Magi who traveled to Jerusalem were from the Parthian Empire. So let's talk about them. In 250 BC, about 80 years after Alexander the Great, the Parthians succeeded in breaking away from the Seleucids and formed their own kingdom. And during the 1st century BC, they grew into a very powerful empire. In fact, their empire stretched from the Euphrates River all the way to the Indian Ocean. Let me just show you a slide that shows you their empire. Notice that it covers all of modern-day Iraq today, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and portions of India. It was a huge empire. But it's also at this time that the Roman Empire is starting to come on the scene. Let me show you the Roman Empire. Here the Roman Empire is coming in. But if you notice, the Roman Empire begins to end before the Parthian Empire. It doesn't come all the way in there. Why? Because the Parthian Empire is a very strong empire. So Judea became a buffer zone between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire. Let me show you a slide that shows the buffer zone. Now you can see the Roman Empire, you can see the Parthian Empire, but you can also see that Syria, Lebanon, talking about modern day nations, in Israel is the buffer zone between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire, and that's very important. I'm going to explain why. The Parthian Empire was a rival to Rome, and several battles occurred between them during the 1st century. Now, here's what most people don't realize. The Parthians won the majority of those battles. If you remember Pompey, the first Roman who conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, attacked the Armenian outpost of Parthian, he lost. He got his tail kicked by the Parthian Empire. Go back and read the history. In 55 BC, Crassus led several Roman legions against Parthia, and he lost 30,000 men plus all of his commanders. People he was soundly defeated. And the Parthians then led a counterattack, and they captured Palestine. So now this buffer zone is under Parthian control until around 34 BC. The Romans finally came in, and they took control of Palestine around 34 BC. In fact, what's interesting is Herod is actually made king of the Jews during this time where he's exiled. And when he does come back to Israel, he can't even go to Jerusalem because it's not been conquered yet and it's still underneath Parthian control. And the majority of us don't know that. But it's true. So my point is this. During the 1st century, you didn't mess with the Parthian Empire. And at the time of Christ's birth, Herod was ruling a country that was between 2 rival empires, the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. Rome was to the west, to which Herod was loyal to and submitted to, and Parthia was to the east, but Israel was a buffer zone between the 2. Now, one of the reasons that Herod was allowed to be king of the Jews is because it was a buffer zone. It was much easier to keep Parthia from coming in and trying to conquer it if Rome didn't make it part of theirs, even though Rome was there. And Herod, in a sense, was nothing more than a puppet. At least he could say, I am king of the Jews. And the majority of us, as Christians, don't know that. We've never been taught Old Testament history. Now, in the Parthian Empire, the Magi's role in government was elevated to an even greater role. Not only did they serve as the priest and the king's counselors, his most trusted advisors, but they also became the group that chose the king's successor whenever a king became sick or whenever a king died. So the Magi were a very powerful group. And that explains why Herod and all of Jerusalem were troubled when the Magi arrived looking for the king of the Jews. First of all, they would have arrived with a full military escort. I don't know why, but we have this picture that it was three men, because there were three gifts, dressed in these Persian robes, riding on camels all by themselves. And when they come into Jerusalem, everyone is troubled. Well, you had caravans all the time, people. They came in Jerusalem from Saudi Arabia, from the Parthian Empire. There was trade going on. So why in the world would Magi cause all of Jerusalem to be troubled? It's because they came in a full military escort. People, these were powerful men that held the highest positions in the Parthian Empire. They chose each king. Whenever a king became sick, it was the Magi who chose his successor. Or whenever a king died, they're the ones who chose his successor. So they traveled with a full military escort. You're talking about a cavalry coming in. And then you have a lot of pomp and display as the Magi come in. A very powerful group. Secondly, they were looking for a king. And these men were the ones who chose who would be king of their empire. And for the last century, Judah had been going back and forth between Parthian rule and Roman rule. At times, it was underneath the Parthian control, but at the moment, it was under Roman control. But if they chose a king from Judah, there would be war. Now, I want you to think about this. They come in and they say, where is the king of the Jews that has been born? Now, wait a minute. Who has been given the title King of the Jews? Herod has been, by Caesar himself. He is the King of the Jews, and now, all of a sudden, the Magi come in, who are the kingmakers, and they're saying, where is the King of the Jews that's been born? Now, when they said King of the Jews, did they mean that they were going to pick a person who was going to be the king over all of the Medo-Persian Empire? He was going to be a Jew? Well, if that was the case, then that would mean that this Jew who would become the king of all the Medo-Persian Empire, he would want to annex in his home country, which meant there would be war. So when he comes in asking where the king of the Jews is, where he's been born, all of Jerusalem, along with Herod, are troubled. Now, let me tell you what we've always been taught, and I'm sure you've been taught this. Lisa and I were taught that the reason all Jerusalem was troubled is because Herod was very paranoid. And he would do some drastic things, even kill his family. So when these Magi came in asking where the king of the Jews was, Herod was troubled. And when Herod was troubled, everyone was troubled. How many of you have been taught that? People, that's not true. All Jerusalem was troubled because they were thinking, oh no, there's going to be another war. They've been in this buffer zone for the last century. There had been battles going back and forth. Everyone was trying to come in and control this peace, and they were allowing this to be the buffer zone. But whenever there was any battles, whenever there were any wars, it was going to take place in their homeland. And now they're asking where the king of the Jews are, and they're thinking, oh, no. Do they mean that they're going to take a Jew and make him king of the Medo-Persian Empire? Now, I know many of you are thinking, now, wait a minute, would they have done that? Of course. You need to understand, when Daniel comes in with the Magi and he brings all these Jews in, they begin to infiltrate. If you read the story of Esther, she comes in and she's the queen. So many of the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire had Jewish blood in them. Most of the Magi had Jewish blood. So this was a very real possibility. So that explains why all of Jerusalem was troubled when these Magi come to Jerusalem looking for the king of the Jews. But it doesn't explain why they were looking for the king of the Jews in the first place. So let me help you out with that. By the time of the Parthian Empire, Daniel had become a legend among the Magi. Now, when I say legend, I don't mean that he was a mythical person. No. He was a very real person. All of these things that happened. When I say he was a legend, I meant that he was a hero. He was a heroic person. Now, Daniel died sometime around 528 BC. But by the first century, he was a legend among the Magi. They had studied his writings and they knew them by heart. They knew his life story. They knew that he not only had the ability to interpret dreams, but he could literally tell the king what he had dreamed before he told him. They knew that his followers had been thrown into a fiery furnace, and even the hair on their head had not been singed. And a fourth man was seen walking in the fiery furnace with them, and he looked like the Son of Man. They knew he himself was thrown into a lion's den, and he was not harmed. Yet when all of his accusers were thrown in, every one of them were killed by the lions. But the greatest thing was that he had the gift of prophetic visions. He knew exactly what would happen in the future concerning kingdoms. He had prophesied the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, and it happened just as he had prophesied. He had prophesied what Alexander the Great would do, and it happened just like he said it would. And he had prophesied that Alexander the Great's empire would be divided in 4 ways, and it happened just as he said. He had prophesied that another empire was going to rise, greater than any empire before them, and the Parthian Empire watched during the first century as the Roman Empire began to expand, and it became one of the greatest empires that has ever been. So Daniel was a legend among the Magi. But there was just one prophetic vision that hadn't been fulfilled yet. And that was the vision of the 70 weeks. Daniel had prophesied that from the time that the command was given to rebuild Jerusalem to the time the Messiah would present himself would be 69 sevens, Shabuas, Haptids. Now, if we want to convert that, that would be 483 years. And we're talking about Jewish years, which would be 360 days. So they knew that it was getting very close to the time that this Messiah would be born, this one who would be King of the Jews. And that's why they were studying the stars. They knew which star was his. And next week, I'm going to show you which star was the Messiah's star and how they knew that. Now, they knew which star was his because most of them had Jewish blood. So they knew all of the messianic prophecies, and they had studied the Torah because Daniel had implemented that all the way back in the Babylonian Empire. He had changed so many things that went on into the Medo-Persian Empire, and by the time the Parthian Empire comes into play, the majority of the Magi have Jewish blood in them. So they were looking for a sign that would indicate that the Messiah had come, the King of the Jews, because they wanted to worship this mighty King of the Jews. They understood that he was not to be the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, but he was to be the king of the universe, the mighty one that Daniel had written about and prophesied would come. Now, next week, I'm going to show you what they were looking for and why, and what they saw that confirmed that this was truly the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the King not only of the Jews, but the King of all the universe.